Afternoon, everyone. Absolutely delighted to have you here for this post-lunch session on the future of free markets, capitalism in an age of populism. This is an issue we've been talking a fair bit about implicitly or explicitly throughout the conference. So here we are making this a very central theme of the discussion this afternoon, and I'm delighted to be joined by a splendid panel to help us think through these issues. Seated to my far left is Sreeram Visvanathan, who is the head of government for IBM and has spent a lot of time thinking about the role of business and government in navigating technological shifts in the economy, bring that perspective in. To my immediate left is Professor Diane Coyle, who is the Bennett Professor of Policy at a small university somewhat east of here that most of us have probably never heard of, called Cambridge. Diane is, of course, one of the country's leading economists on technological policy. We'll bring that perspective into it. To my right is Li Xin. Li Xin is the managing editor of Caixin magazine. For those of you who don't know Caixin, Caixin is sort of like the Economist magazine of China. It is one of the most interesting magazines to come out of mainland China, edited entirely by people from the mainland, and for reasons that are actually quite interesting, on which we wrote a case on. Caixin has been able to navigate the process of being an independent journalist or journalism outlet in China and do that in a sustainable way. So there's a lot to be said about that. And then, of course, to my far right is Jonathan Dimson, who is the global head of McKinsey's practice in public finance, and will help us understand the implications for these questions from a public finance perspective. Before we dive right in, I want to take a quick poll from the room. I first want to see how many of you, in your view, in your personal view, see free markets as essential to the way of life in your home country over the course of the next 20 years. Okay, very good. I was a little worried after yesterday's session on inequality. I just want to see if we can quickly break that down by those of you who spend most of your time in emerging market countries and those of you who spend most of your time in developed countries. So if you happen to be coming from an emerging market country, do you see free markets as essential? So let's just go ahead. How many of you spend most of your time in emerging markets countries? Okay, and leave your hands up if you see free markets as essential to the way of life. Okay, and how many, raise your hands for those of you who come from developed countries, rich countries, spend most of your time there, and see free markets as essential to the way of life in your society for the next 20 years. Good, fantastic. That gives us a sense of the mood of the room as we dive into these issues. So liberal markets represent one of the most potent social innovations that we have developed over the course of the last 200 years. And more than any other known system of economic organization have ushered in tremendous prosperity for the world. Just in the case of India and China alone, over the course of the last 20 years or so, arguably up to 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty through the introduction of liberal market reforms. Of course, there are many other things that have happened in these countries over that time period, but there's something to be said for that. But beyond the case for economic prosperity that is often made in the context of free markets, the case for free markets has also been made in the context of political liberalism. So Milton Friedman famously said that economic freedoms beget political freedoms. And that is, in fact, the key normative justification for free market capitalism, that it is, in fact, the technology that enables the principles of the Enlightenment to be lived out in a modern society. At least this was Friedman's claim. And this is another sort of reason why we've seen free markets be the sort of potent or dominant system of economic organization in many parts of the world. But arguably today, free markets are at a nadir. Despite the popularity or relative popularity of free markets in this room, a good chunk of, as many as 42% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 29 do not see free markets as essential to the American way of life over the course of the next 20 years. This is a country that has, for the longest period of time, served as the home turf, if you must, for free markets. And similarly, free markets has experienced declining popularity here in the UK. And so part of our challenge over the course of this next hour and some is to understand what the causes for this declining popularity in free markets are, understand what, if anything, we should be doing about it, or whether, in fact, this is much ado about nothing. Those are all legitimate hypotheses that we're willing to consider, and we want to keep this as interactive as possible because I know a lot of you have a lot to say about this issue. So we're going to try to bring as many of you in as possible. So as you have the questions around what we're thinking and talking about, do start writing them down so that we can bring them in as early as possible. So I'm going to kick off with some data. I'm an economist, so I like to ground that right up in the beginning. And I want to start with the sense that we heard a lot about Piketty and we heard a lot about the increasing distribution or the increasing skewness in the wealth distribution and earnings distribution yesterday. And there's certainly a lot to be said about that, and certainly a cause for great concern. The fact that the returns to wealth and earning potential is highly right skewed in the population. But there are equally an equally potent or visible source of economists in the world, notably, for instance, Bruce Meyer, the University of Chicago, who argues that actually if you look at consumption equality in countries like the United States over the course of the last 30 or 40 years, consumption has actually done fairly well. So consumption inequality is not as much of a concern as wealth inequality. And this is because technology has, despite creating inequalities in society on wealth measures, has enabled improvements in human conditions, in human flourishing in other ways, and therefore consumption inequality has remained relatively flat in the United States across a fairly stable period of time. And so maybe we're looking at some of the wrong measures. But if we go back to Milton Friedman and we say that no, in fact, one of the things we need to be looking at here is not just the capacity of free markets to deliver on certain goods and services or the capacity of free markets to deliver on earning potential, but that there is, in fact, true value of dignity from labor. And that one of the key reasons why it is we invest in a free market society is so that people can experience and earn the fruits of their own labor, then that might be actually a very useful way to look at the performance of free markets over the course of the last 40 years or so that have started to provoke a lot of investigation in society. And so in this next graph that follows, what you have on the x-axis is the percentile of human capital distribution in the U.S. working population. So this is based on data from the Labor Department and from the U.S. Census. And what we've done for this graph is simply look at the Labor Department's rankings of various occupations in the United States based on the cognitive intensity of those occupations, and then arrange that across census data into percentile bins. So that what you have on the x-axis is a sort of measure of human skills in the population. And what you have on the y-axis is simply real hourly wages. And the red bar there is the real hourly wages across the distribution of skills in the U.S. population in the year 1980. And the blue bar is the distribution or the return to the wage return to human capital skills in 2017. And one of the things that becomes apparent when you look at these two is that while we've seen substantial appreciation in real wages at the top end of the distribution, certainly in the top 5 percentile, which have been blown out in this graph, but even in the 60th percentile and beyond, as you start looking below the 40th percentile, real wages have actually stagnated across the skill distribution. And in fact, in the lower 20th percentile, real wages are below where they were. Right? So even if you hold aside the concerns about consumption inequality being relatively flat, and you hold aside the concerns about wealth inequality and what effects that might have, and so regardless of your politics, and if you say, well, one of the things we really want is for a free market system that allows people to earn some real wage improvement over time based on the skills they can bring to the marketplace, then what this graph is telling us is that for those of you who find themselves in the lower 40th percentile of the skill distribution, real wages haven't improved over the course of 4 decades. Right? Now, what this next graph does is do this more or less the same thing for India. And it does this for the years 1983 and 2012. Those are sort of the closest proxies we were able to get for this. And what you notice about this is, of course, there is an improved this is real weekly wages in the context of India, real weekly wages across the distribution, particularly at the top end of the distribution. But importantly, even at the lower parts of the distribution, so looking across the entire distribution, since the introduction of liberal market reforms in India, we've seen an appreciation in real hourly wages. Right, so if Milton Friedman were to look at this graph, he would say it doesn't matter, for instance, that the graph has gotten more skewed, more convex, to use the mathematical term, on the right-hand side, because what has actually happened is a rising tide has lifted all boats. But that's not the picture we saw in the context of the United States, right? And so this is part of the issue, or sort of the contrasting record of free markets, if you must, that we're grappling with in these two countries. And so one of the questions that we have been grappling with here in this conference over the last 2 days is what role has various types of public policy played in this? And of course, automation and technology has factored in substantially as an explanation. And two of our colleagues here at the University of Oxford, Carl Frey and Michael Osborne, produced a very famous study now looking at jobs at risk of automation over the course of the next 10 or 15 years. And what we did is take all of those jobs and plot them on our x-axis, which is, again, the percentile of human capital distribution. So basically, the distribution of skills in the United States over the course of 2017. And you find that the vast majority of the Frey and Osborne jobs that are vulnerable to computerization over the course of the next decade happen to fall in the lower part of the skill distribution. In fact, the only real occupation that falls above the 85th percentile is accountants and auditors, which is a completely different story that we won't have time to get into, but one that I'm personally very, very interested in. So this gives you a sense of the role of technology in this, or the implication of technology in this picture, and in some sense the kind of political issues that we're going to have to grapple with over the course of the next few years. But the other issue that we've dealt with is globalization, right? And so what this does is look at jobs that were vulnerable to offshoring in the year 1980 based on a data collected by an economist called Lori Kletzer. And simply, again, what we did was plot those jobs based on the human capital distribution. And you can see that while there is a sort of fair representation of those jobs across the distribution, most of them happen to be, again, below the 60th percentile of the distribution. The first wave of offshoring in the United States in the 1980s and even in the early 1990s dealt with manufacturing. But as we went into manufacturing-based offshoring, those who were servicing the offshoring of manufacturing services, they found that their skills actually became more valuable in the economy, and they started experiencing improvements in their real wages as a result. But ironically and perversely, what that meant was that the next wave of offshoring was focused on them because they were the ones earning the higher wages and they were the jobs that were vulnerable. And so economist Alan Blinder did, in some sense, the same exercise as Lori Klepser did with regards to offshoring. But instead of looking at offshoring of manufacturing-related jobs, looked at offshoring of service-related jobs in the year 2006 and the decade before. And when you plot that on... And when you plot that on the distribution of human capital skills, you see that, in fact, the jobs that are vulnerable to offshoring have started to move rightward on the distribution. This is to say that there are now more jobs vulnerable to manufacturing, to service-based offshoring that are in the middle part of the distribution of skills. And you could imagine from a policy implication that initially, while we thought this was a low-skill problem, it could over time become a middle-skill problem, and eventually, with advances in artificial intelligence, become a fairly high-skill problem. So this is all just to lay out, in some sense, the context of the problem that we're grappling with as we think about the future of free markets. And what I'm going to do next is to turn it over to Professor Coyle, who is, again, an expert in the question of the policies that enable technologies in the economy and what implications those have for the patterns that we've seen so far in the economy, and importantly, what lessons we can learn from those policies going forward as we think about creating or reimagining a system of free markets that will work in the Western world, but also in the emerging world for the next 20 years or so. Professor Coyle.
Thank you very much, Karthik. And we are setting up a new public policy institute in Cambridge, Bennett Institute for Public Policy. So it's a real pleasure to be here today in Oxford and tell you how marvellous we're going to be. And please take a look at our website and keep up with what we're doing. So I take a couple of lessons from the data that we've seen so far just for two countries, which is that countries are different. And one of the things that immediately tells you is that there's no such thing as a free market, that national institutions and national governments can make a difference to the outcomes people experience in their lives. And all markets operate within a framework of laws and regulations and also social and cultural norms. So I think it's pretty clear that the, whatever you want to call them, the liberal market economies, the social market economies of the OECD countries are not working well now, at least in the minimal sense that either significant minorities or majorities of voters are expressing serious discontent with the state of things. And to some extent, this is still legacy of the financial crisis. There have been no increases in living standards for that reason, at least for a decade or so in many countries. But it's made the sort of grotesque inequality that you can see in some of the figures, the corporate greed, the plutocratic wealth that you can observe, intolerable to people as opposed to just distasteful to people. And you simply can't have viable democracies in which some people who are admired and rewarded in the official culture avoid tax and raid pensions, while other people who are working very hard have to use food banks to get by from week to week. So that sense that things aren't working, that we have what people call populism, isn't really surprising in this context. Now, some of the phenomena that we're observing, they reflect political choices about what tax cuts, about deregulation, about union bashing, and so on. But what I want to do is reflect a bit on the extent to which they are due to technology, technological trends as well. So you might ask, well, what does technology have to do with it? And the answer is that the spread of information and communication technologies for 20, 25 years now has changed the structure of the economy profoundly. It reduces the cost of transferring and processing information, and that has an immediate consequence for organizational forms. If information is expensive, then you want a hierarchy in the way that a hub-and-spoke airport is an efficient way of transporting people. That's the efficient way of transporting information. So when you reduce those costs, it brought about a really big change in corporate structures. First of all, globalization, the ability to offshore because you could operate the transfer of IP and the logistics that make that possible. So the globalization was technology-driven, and also the move towards networks, ecologies of companies and networks. So that's part of the story. These technologies also have very high fixed costs and very low marginal costs. So there are big economies of scale. And we see these winner-take-all phenomena, superstar phenomena. And sometimes these have developed into markets which are not contestable. That Schumpeterian competition, rivalry between one producer and another producer to see who can win the market, that's not occurring in all cases, and we see rising monopoly rents. And clearly a lot of people fear that the inequality that this is driving is going to get worse, because we fear that there's a whole bunch more automation, and the Frey and Osborne study was a good example of that. I'm a little sceptical that it's going to happen fast, and in fact, in many countries' data, we can hardly see it happening at all. We would like more automation because productivity performance has been very poor. But to the extent that it does happen, it's going to disrupt people's livelihoods. And actually, it's happened twice before in the recent past. In the 1980s, in the 1990s, there were waves of automation that drove deindustrialization in the OECD countries, and policy dealt with that really badly. So the fears might be overstated in one sense about scale or speed, but I think probably understated in another sense that nobody still has a good policy solution for addressing them. There's also kind of intangible fear, I guess, that AI is placing power in a small number of hands, and people perhaps don't understand it very much, or fear it a bit. And it's possible to observe some, quite damaging effects on society, and there's a fear that power is going to be exercised irresponsibly. So regulators, politicians are scrambling to catch up with what's been happening in digital markets. I would confidently predict that some regulation is coming, although it might not be as well evidenced as one might like. And I think some of the big digital companies have brought it on themselves. If you don't pay your tax, if you damage the democratic process, perhaps irrevocably, why would you expect to sustain your social license to operate? Companies never can shed the ultimate responsibility for their product. But this is kind of retrospective, this is catching up, and I think there's a question too about the prospective and what can we do now? What lessons should we draw for future innovation? And I think the policy debate is just a bit too techno-determinist about it. It takes the technology and the direction of technical change as a given and says, how can we correct the bad things that might happen? I think governments have much more power than they exercise to determine the direction of technology and its consequences. And that goes all the way from what research do you fund, and how can you ensure that alongside commercially funded research, there is pro-social research that's being funded by governments. Part of that will be always aligning the social science and the humanities with the science and the technology. What are the business models that people are going to operate? Within what social norms do they operate? What kind of accountability structures will there be? Think about that beforehand and not after. There are government procurement policies. Governments spend a lot of money and could think about not going for the lowest possible cost, but thinking about the longer-term social benefits that come from procuring certain kinds of technology rather than others. They can think about principles-based regulation in a field where the technology itself is changing extremely rapidly. And they can overcome what I would see as a kind of bizarre political hesitation, because ultimately political power does come into this, and governments still have a lot of it in their own nations. One of the characteristics of AI, which I've been trying to understand more, is that it makes really clear the judgments and the biases that have been kind of fuzzy in the past. It sheds a really bright light, for example, on social biases that we've already had in our decision-making that get embedded in data, and now it becomes clear what they have been. And in one way, that's going to be helpful. In another way, it's really uncomfortable, because fuzzy is useful in politics. It's useful for hiding conflicts of interest. And I think we will have to face up to some of the dilemmas that we have been skating over for the past 25 years. But I think the bottom line about that is that the accountability debate needs to happen now, and the policy debate about technology really has to step up a gear. Thanks, Karthik.
Thank you, Diane. Sreeram, I want to turn to you next, and there are a couple of themes in Diane's remarks that I hope you pick up as you go on forward. You're at the cutting edge of, in fact, a firm that develops that technology and deploys that technology ostensibly with the intent to improve human flourishing, to improve the human condition. But of course, we've heard over the course of the last 2 days there's profound social disruption that accompanies that, and then there is the anxiety. And one solution, in fact, is to put control back in the hands of government and think about regulation as actually the effective policy tool to navigate this process. Is that the way forward in your mind, or how do we navigate the coming age of technology?
It's an interesting question, isn't it, Karthik? So I want to go back in history, because I think looking back, pausing and looking back at history is a good way of reflecting on what we should do in the future and whether government should become more control-oriented in terms of how technology comes into play. But go back to the beginning of the 1900s and electricity and how manufacturing changed. And I think there was an adoption curve of 20 to 30 years where many industries went through, they still survived in the old tools, technologies for decades, right, before it was widely adopted. And I think we are right at the beginning of a cusp of automation. We are not at the end of it. We are on a journey where 20% of the data that's out there is searchable. 80% is still not searchable. It's unstructured. And so we are right at the beginning of this curve of automation. We're not at the end of it. And the sense of panic on we're going to lose jobs, we're going to change professions, I think to an extent is not totally founded in reality. And there's a little bit of hysteria which also happened in the previous in previous technological transformations. There's some data points to prove that. So in 2017, a group of US-based scholars did some research. And what they did is they took occupational data, they took recruitment ads on the web, and they applied some natural language processing to say, over the last 40 years, how many professions have really disappeared? And the reality is 93% of the professions that existed in the 1960s still exist today. The tasks that happen within those professions have somewhat changed. So to go back to Professor Coyle, I think 100% of professions will be influenced by augmented intelligence. I think 100% of industry will change, but I don't think the professions themselves will disappear. It's just going to get more effective. The tasks, the way that you use insight, you leverage data, is going to be better for industry and for nations. Now that's going to lead to opportunities for those who adopt it, embrace it faster. It's going to lead to imbalances that we've been talking about for the last 2 years for those who don't move quickly enough, right? So what can we do about that? Just in the UK, there was a PwC research which said augmented intelligence is actually going to create as many jobs as you lose, or as they change through AI, right? You're going to get, and it's going to have a profound impact, positive impact on the GDP, additive impact on GDP, right? So the intelligence that we have at the moment is a little bit conflicted. I don't think we know enough to make a decision on what role should government play in this. But one thing is very clear. So go back to the beginning of the 1900s. In the US, over 50% of the population worked in the agriculture industry, right? If you go into the data today, less than 2% work in the agriculture industry. Over 50% to less than 2%. Has that 48% differential resulted in unemployment, or has it resulted in a different type of employment, right? And so what did we do with that situation? Government, businesses, and the individuals focused on net new occupations and net new skills. And I would argue that we need to do exactly the same thing now. We need to step back and say, what are those new professions? What opportunities does this open up? What skills do we need to build? What is the role of government in opening up new avenues of education, in looking at education policy? There's also an argument that people are going to live a lot longer, which means we all have to become lifelong learners. So how do we as individuals adopt the latest in technology to be those lifelong learners, to look at these professions, to look at how we can go to the right-hand side of your curve and stay ahead of how AI can catch up with you. And I think the debate between academia and government and individuals and businesses needs to happen in that realm of how do we keep professionals to the right side of your curve as long as we can as each economy matures. So that's kind of what we think. And for us, can AI be disruptive? Absolutely yes, but that's why we've introduced some important policy statements as a technology leader. We've said, we've published a data policy which says your data is your data, your insight is your insight. We're not going to use it. We're not going to commercialize it. We're not going to make money on the back of it. We've defined that being open is vital, that you should have choice on what technology you use and how you glue it together for the greater good of your business or for the country. And we've said, security needs to be at the center of everything. But what we're redefining is the power of technology, but then the reimagination of professions and industries is down to the individual in the countries. So I think we're at the beginning of this cusp. We've got some time to argue and debate and regulate this, and there's no right or wrong answer. It'll be an interesting thing to watch over the next 10 years.
Fantastic. So note of optimism there, time to debate as we focus on this. And maybe that part of that debate will involve the role and scale of the public sector, Jonathan. And so one of the questions for us, if we take Sreeram's premise that, historically technology and massive technological advances have delivered transformations in the economy, those transformations still require enormous public investment to get people to go from being 50% employed in agriculture to 2% being employed in agriculture. So how do we think about public revenue in this world and the money that's needed to invest in that?
So let's start a little bit on what do we know and what don't we know, and then what might we do about it. So I was just looking at these certainties. My daughters are 15, so their working life could extend out, depending on what happens on retirement ages, could be up to, 70, 80, 90 years' time. So I was looking back and saying, so what did we know in 1950? What were we really sure about? So what would be a good job? So I'm in danger of copying a couple of the ones, not agriculture. So the thing I was looking at, so steel workers. Steel workers in America, there was 500,000. Today, there are more interior designers than steel workers. So that was a bad job to get into if you were graduating. There was another one, if we go to the UK, steel workers, they had about 500,000, or 330,000 in 1950. There's now more personal trainers than there are steel workers. I'm not even sure personal training existed as a job in 1950. One that did strike me that was quite odd, though, was 1.5 million secretaries and typists. Astonishingly, in the UK, there are also 1.5 million secretaries and typists in the UK. So bizarrely, the most predictable job you could do was be a secretary or typist, the only one that's not changed in 65 years in the UK. So a lot of the time when we think about what the future of free markets are, we are guessing the future. There are many areas we don't know. Just to bring this one last one to life, have you seen Carpool Karaoke? James Corden, quick. A few people nodding. Who's seen the Paul McCartney one? Few. Okay. It's fantastic. It has nothing to do with the future of free markets, except for one point. If you watch and it's well worth watching the Paul McCartney Carpool Karaoke, he goes back to his home that he lived in 50 years ago. And the question is, and I was reflecting as I plug ever more devices in every night, where I plug in about 8 things. It looks like a small nuclear reactor under my bed. It glows orange all night. He had 4 things he plugged in his childhood house. You plugged in the TV, you plugged in the phone, you plugged in the fridge, and you plugged in the radio. No one would have comprehended that you needed way more than 4 plugs in a house. But I know when we were redoing our house a few years back, my daughter in her bedroom needed something like 15 plugs. So some of this stuff we really, really don't know. There are some things, though, we do know, and we absolutely know, but we've not thought through what's going to happen properly. So, and they're obvious stuff. There's the aging, there's urbanization, there is the shift on global economics, shift to China. I'm not going to talk about China because I have a much more knowledgeable colleague next to me on China. and also advancing technology that Diane's already talked about. But let's just pick out the aging, because I was looking at the OECD numbers. 2015, the dependency ratio is just around, what is it, 23%. I think it's 23, let me get it, 27, sorry, 27.9% dependency ratio. So basically, one person retired for every 3 in work. That's in OECD countries, people have sort of got their head around that. It's not moved that much in the last few years. Within 35 years, it goes to 53%. So in the next 35 years, when pretty much everyone in this room will still be, certainly hopefully be alive, but probably working, we're going to be in a 2-to-2, 2 working for 2 retired, or in a different type of life if the retirement age has got up a bit. But we've not thought through the start of that. But it's totally obvious it's going to happen. It is happening now. We know it's going to happen. Similarly, some of the technology streams, similarly, some of the shift in economics. So you're then stuck with the question, some stuff you don't know what's going to happen, some you do, and then what do governments do about it? We're seeing 4 things that are a big deal for governments to worry about. One is the human capital that was just alluded to. I vividly remember I was speaking with something called HEFCE, which is the Higher Education Funding Council. And there was a meeting with all these university chancellors. And one of the chancellors stood up and said, it's really strange. We are in a battle to the death over 18-year-olds. But we don't really compete that hard for 28, 38, 48 or 58-year-olds. And I was struck by that comment because just this week there was a report that 12 universities in the UK are on the brink of bankruptcy. It may depend exactly which university, but and in the US, I know colleagues of mine spend their time turning around universities that are stuck because they've borrowed too much. So there's a real shift now, and change happens when people have to change. So this is the moment. So what's the proposition of 28, 38, 48, 58 on lifelong learning and education? The second big thing for us is rethinking safety nets and support. A lot of coverage on mental health, the value of work, and how do if people are living through 4 or 5 technology transitions, what does government need to do? And at least in my mind, the link between welfare and health, and most countries run welfare systems separate from health. They might have a bit on physical disability, but how do you help people go through the reality of job loss, retraining, relearning, and then succeeding again? If you need to do it 5 times through your career, 5 technology revolutions, government's way off that, but maybe it starts by collapsing welfare and health systems together. Very few countries are doing that at the moment. So that's the second. Third is an obvious one that will probably many of you in Oxford, housing crisis and housing. Oxford shares a stat with, I think it's Vancouver and also, there's many countries around the world, but of the house prices being 12 times average income, which is the true measure of unaffordability. It shares it with Cambridge. There are a few countries that have really got smart about housing. Singapore is an unbelievable story. If you look at the house price graph in Singapore, it's just flat. Average house price flat. Every other country goes thump. Singapore, it just goes flat. And so they've done some amazing stuff about both demand and supply. And so I think really getting to grips on housing, I know multiple countries are talking about it. I think relatively few have done enough. But Singapore is very good at going and looking at what the rest of the world does. On this, it's well worth looking at what Singapore has done. But if we look across each of those 3 topics, the need to really rethink learning, welfare and health, and housing, they're all going to consume a ton of cash. And so one of the things, just linking back to the original question, Karthik, we are seeing much, much more innovation and technology in tax and revenue raising. So actually being really thoughtful and smart about how do you use analytics to really say, how do I fully collect the tax that should be being collected by whatever government of the day? We estimate there's a 5 trillion global gap. 1 trillion of that, so 20% could be recovered by just better operations. So there's a big opportunity to raise the cash to then invest. Similarly, in the session earlier we had, there were the start of a more ambitious conversation about tax policy, and Clive Cowdery was much more articulate about that. And I think there's interesting things he was proposing on being more radical. But so just keen to debate any of those topics that are helpful for you as we think through how to mitigate and manage the effects of free markets.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jonathan. And Lixian, I'm going to turn to you to bring in two perspectives for us. First is to give us a sense of how all of this is being viewed from the perspective of China, particularly as it looks at the existential questions that are being raised about free markets in countries like the US and the UK. And second, to reflect on China's own strategy in thinking this forward, because in some sense, the challenge for China is to get rich before it gets obviated by technology, which is a luxury that in some sense the US and the UK have been afforded. And so help us understand both of these perspectives.
Thank you, Karthik. And thank you for giving us so much support at the school for hope of independent journalism in China. I'm a journalist, so I'll start with a story on how this is perceived in China. So one very famous story was back in 2008, the then Vice Premier of China, Wang Qishan, called his counterpart, which is in US, Hank Paulson, the Treasury Secretary, and says, "Hank, what happened to you? We don't have a teacher anymore." And that was the financial crisis. And starting from 2008, 2009, you kind of see a very strong skepticism, and China has been very disillusioned of at least the financial system in the West. And then you have Brexit, you have Trump, and given the populism on the rise in the West for the last couple of years, the disillusion is even stronger, not just about the financial system, but about the capitalism in general, the Western capitalism. But having said that, there's still a very strong support or faith about free market and market liberalization in China. And that seems slightly conflict, but in essence, it's not. And I have to define the terms a little bit because we don't say so much about capitalism in China because that has so much ideological implications. We use the term as market liberalization, and it's essentially very similar. So why do people support market liberalization? Because fundamentally, it delivers good results. The result has been described by Karthik at the very beginning, that if you compare China, this year we'll celebrate the 40-year anniversary of China's opening up. And if you compare 40 years back in 1979, 9 out of 10 Chinese are living under poverty line of $2 per day. And now, 40 years later, people living under the poverty line is 1 out of 100. And the major force behind that is by opening up and integrate it into the global trading system and become a more freer market in terms of labor, capital, ideas. And people understand that. And also another phase of that is coming from a lot of the fundamental infrastructure of free market is laid in China in the last 40 years. Laws. When China finished the Cultural Revolution, there were actually only 2 laws in China: marriage law and the constitution. Not because marriage is that important. And then right after China entered the WTO, that within 1 or 2 years, more than 10 laws passed, and these are related to commercial activities and patent and then how to settle commercial disputes and stuff like that. So legal system and ranging from a lot of institutions, the professionals, and especially people's mindset are there. And people believe that this is the way to go. And the last but not least is you can see the free market advocates are still in very high position. And early this year, both Financial Times and Wall Street Journal had articles about there's a dream team technocrats of China in China are in position, ranging from the vice premier to the central bank governor, and all these people are very strong advocates of free market and market liberalization. So combine all this together, I think the belief of free market is still very, very strong, but there's obviously a sense of complacency started to grow after 2009, after the financial crisis, that maybe there are failures in the Western style market that we can make up. And maybe there is a China model. We don't believe there is something so unique about China's success. It's actually because China checked a lot of the box that proven to be successful in the capitalism system. So that's the perception of it. And another story we wrote this week is this Politburo Standing Committee, the all-powerful group, hold a studying session, and they do that every quarter and every couple of months. And this study session concentrated on AI. So you can imagine those 70-year people and try to decipher AI. And the keywords emerging out of that is not replacement of jobs, although that's very important. If you put that in the Chinese perspective, 1.4 billion people, the labor force is 770 million. And out of that, 230 million are manufacturing-related jobs. So if that's wiped out by automation, that would be at least, well, by McKinsey study, 50% of that. So that would be at least 400 million-ish job will be replaced by that. But their concern now is less about that, but more about self-reliance. Self-reliance is because we are in the trade dispute with the US, and especially the tech dispute. The US is more suspicious of China in terms of tech development, in terms of investment and reciprocity and all that. So it's a wake-up call that the Chinese policymakers feel we need to have more homegrown champions. We need to have more technologies that are owned by Chinese companies. But it's a very, very tricky question. I mean, in a globalized world, how self-reliant you can be dealing with the technology that is so global and that is you have to utilizing not just the talents globally, but also the market globally. But looking back in terms of how fast technology has advanced in China, there are some amazing numbers. I was even shocked when I was reading this a couple of weeks ago. Online mobile payment in China last year totaled 19 trillion US dollar. And the GDP of China was 12 trillion. And before I boarded the plane to come to Oxford, I reminded myself, you need to get some cash. Because last time in China I was using some cash, probably was like 3 months ago. Everything is so mobile, and technology development has brought so much convenience to Chinese, not just to urban Chinese, but also to the rural Chinese. That's the kind of inclusive part of that is amazing. But also that would create the next question is, with such kind of large labor force, especially manufacturing labor force, how do you prepare people for that? And I have to say the preparation is so far very inadequate. But having said that, the faith is in the private sector. And the private sector is actually larger and more powerful in China than they sometimes get credit outside. And one set of number has been cited in the last couple of weeks by the technocrats I just mentioned openly as their support of the private sector is the private companies in China contributed to 50% of tax income, 60% of GDP, 70% of R&D, 80% of urban employment, and 90% of new employment. And many of the tech companies are the backbone of the increasingly the service providers or the tech or the private players. And if you think they replace jobs, they create jobs elsewhere, like share bikes. I'm actually happy to see there are orange little bikes outside parking in Oxford that come from a Chinese share bike company called Mobike. And if you calculate the people hired by Mobike, you think they are engineers? Not so much. More than 80% of them are people driving scooters or driving a little truck because they need to move bikes from one place to another. And they create tens of thousands of jobs just by shipping bikes in the off-peak hours. And also visual recognition companies, Chinese visual recognition unicorns probably has a large number of them. And if you see the people they hired, they have a lot of scientists, of course, but they also hired huge number of people to teach AI how to recognize that. So they just by clicking that to teach the machine, this is this is that, this is different, this person is different from that one, this person is different from that one. So they create other jobs as well. So putting that, I think China has definitely a large market for a lot of the technologies to try, and also has incredible work ethics. We used to say 996, which means from 9 a.m., work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. And that's considered very lenient because a lot of other tech companies will do 997. And coupled with the market, coupled with the work ethics, also coupled with very strong desire to make their life better by the massive Chinese companies and labor force. I think it's interesting to watch, and the policies are playing catching up.
Fantastic. Thank you, Li Xin. So we get a sense for the tremendous potential of technology and AI over the course of the next 20 years or so, but we also get a sense of the anxiety. And there is a sense, of course, that business is playing a leading role in this. Business is the driver of innovation. Business is the driver of problem solving. But our historical record with leaving business in charge of designing the rules of the game suggests that we should be more cautious there. So there remains to be a lot to be thought through, as we've seen from all of these conversations, about how we think about navigating policy over the course of the next 20 years as we are dealing with this. And obviously there's the issues of technology, which are global, but there's the issues of globalization themselves, which affect countries differentially, certainly affecting the US quite differently from China and part of the trade wars. So let's take some questions from the audience as we consider these issues, and maybe we'll take 2 or 3 questions to begin with, try bring them together, and then come back for a second round. So let's start with this side of the room, and it looks like there's a question all the way in the back, Joe.
Thank you very much to the panelists. It's been fascinating. I wanted to ask a question.
Just introduce yourself as well.
Hi, I'm Rebecca from the World Economic Forum. I wanted to ask a question about technology which hasn't been addressed yet in this discussion, and maybe it was addressed in the climate change discussion earlier, which is a statistic which isn't actually that new. It's 10 months old, and I'm just looking at The Guardian here. It's the fact that the communications industry could use 20% of the world's electricity by 2025. So I just wondered, in terms of the interaction between free markets and policy, when it comes to jobs, it seems like we have attention now from business, from policymakers, and from the public. But in terms of the impact of technology on the environment, we haven't yet gone there yet. So we're now looking at ways in which, of course, we're not going to take technology as a panacea, but we are talking more and more about how technology will be even more deeply integrated into our societies. And I just wondered whether there were any policy anticipations for how to deal with the climate effect, actually, of more automation.
Fantastic. Climate effects of more automation. We've got a question in the back there, Mikhail.
I'm Michał. I'm an MPP student here at the Blavatnik School of Government. I wanted we assume that free markets are based on the idea of free will. So I wanted to ask about the future of free will in the age of artificial intelligence. I remember a presentation by IBM about the possibilities of AI tools. And this artificial intelligence by IBM made a massive research based on air temperature and sales in supermarkets, I say Walmart or something. And the question that was asked was, when do people eat soups? When it's cold? No, actually not when it's cold, but when there is a sudden drop of temperature from one day to day. And this produces a very easy business model. You just draw predictions from weather forecasts, and when the sudden drop of temperature is forecast, you just launch a massive ad campaign on the internet with soups. So the temperature drops, and everybody just goes to the shops and buys soups. And my question is, what should be the policy response to such possibilities given by the AI? Should we somehow regulate it, or maybe it's not? Is it a threat to the free will, or is it not?
Okay, is AI a threat to free will? Fantastic. And is there a question on this side that we want to bring in? Okay, again, all the folks in the back are asking questions. Go for it. Is that Max back there? Yes, it is. Sorry. Go for it, Max.
Yeah, so my name is Max. I'm a former MPP student here at the Blavatnik School. My question is about talent and the question of how you regulate, given the current information asymmetry between the private and the public sector. So I've been on a lot of AI conferences over the summer, and the impression I get is that all the data scientists tell me, well, I can work in government, but, you know, the offers are so good from all these companies, you know, I wouldn't even think about like turning an offer down. So my question is this: how should governments address this this information asymmetry in the future, and how can they push for more regulation that makes sense if all the talents are actually in the private sector and are not really attracted by the public sector?
Okay.
Thank you.
How should government address the information asymmetry in technology? Let's take those 3 questions and we'll come back for more. How about we start with the one on free will? That seems like the broadest one, and maybe I can turn to you, Sreeram, on that one, since IBM was mentioned in that context. But so free will in the age of AI, is that something that we should be worried about? And how do you guys think about it within the firm?
Well, it's a tough question, but and the example was a good one, right? So, the reality is none of us can consume the data that we have out there. We collect a lot more data, and a lot of the data that is out there is very unstructured. It's sentiment, it's what people feel, it's and when you're able to put it together and look at it from different lenses, and there was one lens presented there. But you could have many more implications. You could have security implications. So let's talk about security situations. So when you're connecting the dots and you're able to predict that there could be a major security effect incident, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Should there be free will in that situation, right? So this is a complex debate, and it comes back to we're at the start of the debate. And where do you draw the line, and what do you regulate, and what is free will? I would argue that in a lot of cases, we've always used our intelligence, right? All we're saying is now it's man and machine. It's augmented intelligence. And ultimately, the decision-making is still down to us in terms of what we choose to do and what we don't choose to do. So I don't believe in this rhetoric of just because there are multiple ads that are coming out, you're going to go and have soup. You still have a choice to make. And so all you're providing is augmented intelligence in our view, right? But there are policy decisions to be made in more serious big brother type questions that governments have to get involved in.
Okay, let's pick up on that point. And so, the way economists tend to model this is make the difference between preferences and preference functions, right? And so one of the things that we think about is how information affects the way we allocate choices across different preferences. So I might have preference for soup, or I might have preference for ice cream, and how does information affect my preference? But rightly or wrongly, economic models have for long assumed that we can't actually shape the underlying nature of human behavior, that information doesn't change that, doesn't change those fundamental preference functions as much as it allows us to actually sort across differing competing. Is that an outdated way of thinking about it, Diane? Have advances in, say, behavioral economics and in neuroscience perhaps provoke us to rethink the fundamental neoclassical models of economics and how we model the economy?
I think that idea that preferences were fixed was always wrong. And you only have to think about the fashion industry over the last 100 years to see that that's the case, or all the new goods that people buy. But I think that's a great example of AI shining a really bright light on something that happens already, because it's already the case that there's a whole marketing industry that for decades has tried to shape those preferences and make us buy things. And so the consequence for me is therefore to think about rules about truth in advertising and constraints on it. In the rest of the world, in television and newspaper advertising in this country, there are some regulations about what you can and can't do. So maybe we need to think about how to update those.
Fantastic. Lishan, I want to bring you in on this free will question next and actually take a different turn on it, because in some sense, technology has enabled liberties and liberalization in a way that was not previously possible in China, right? So if anything, the march of technology has been toward granting more free will. So is this something that you're worried about, or?
So far, technology in China has been largely positive. Well, I mean, technology is a tool. Tool is neutral, depends on who is using that, and that will amplify the effect of that. But technology in China, well, I mean media. So the positive effect I observed in that is hugely expanded the public sphere and the discussion and the debate and the availability of information regardless of the restrictions. But the technology itself has really enabled and expanded that. So I think that is highly positive. And in terms of from the consumer perspective or from the service perspective, as being very positive in making that available, in providing the availability of services or goods or functionalities that didn't exist before, that people can enjoy, providing a leapfrogging opportunity that can enable them to achieve something they wouldn't even dream before.
Fantastic. Jonathan, I actually want to bring you in on the question of information asymmetry, unless you want to jump in on the technology bit, or the AI bit. But let's focus on that question of information asymmetry, because you do spend a lot of time with governments.
Yeah.
And you know, I mean, in some sense, groups like McKinsey are the first and last line of defense when it comes to information asymmetry in very technical areas where much of the expertise lies in the private sector, and where governments are sort of, you know, flying blind, if you must. Is that enough to solve the problem?
I'm slightly struck by this, you know, is it really impossible for governments to understand what is going on because a certain set of jobs are paying better? So I mean, totally by that. I was struck by one colleague of mine who said, he was remarking that every couple of years there's a job that is the job that everybody wants to get into. So he was reflecting that when he graduated, he's slightly showing his age, it was oil services. And he said if you weren't in Halliburton, it was, you know, you were a failure. And it was like it's going, different jobs at different times are paying the most, whatever. I think the way I'd look at it is most regulators have a tiny proportion of the people in that industry working for them. And you don't need many good people to put together sensible regulation. You could also put together completely terrible regulation as well. So I'm not doing a sort of single protection of regulators, but you don't need many people. Additionally, in most countries, landing regulation requires some sort of consultation process. So you typically do get the very, very smart people from multiple different perspectives, and many times they disagree, and many times they agree. So you'll have from universities, so there's a really simple example, it's a UK example. There's a new Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation just been set up. They went out for a consultation. Or you can just look online. All manner of people from AI institutes to different firms have all contributed to the Centre of Data Ethics, to shape the mandate. So I don't really buy the logic you can't access, or there's this huge information asymmetry, because if you're going to land big stuff, people will want to input. There is a lobbyist problem, but I don't think it's a lack of access to info that's truly the problem here.
Okay. You want to respond to that, Diane, at all on this issue of how governments can address the information asymmetry, and whether we can, in some sense, trust these private intermediaries and institutions like Center for Data Ethics, or whether we need to be doing more to get the actual skills into government?
I don't know that it's a much bigger problem than already exists in some complex areas like financial services, where the same thing would apply. And a number of governments are anyway quite successfully setting up their own data science units. So here, the Office for National Statistics has a successful data science campus. The Competition Authority is just setting up a data science unit. So I think they're catching up.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah. One point I would make is I think AI can be a solution to this problem, right? Because you can go from what source of data and what algorithms and hypotheses have you used to come to the judgment of augmented intelligence. So as we're going through this debate, think about fake news today. Can we go back and trace exactly what the source was? Was it original? Did the incident actually happen? And we struggle with that, right? We really struggle with that, and it has profound impacts in different economies. With augmented intelligence, you take that factor. We announced about a month ago the ability for anybody who uses our AI engine to actually go and look at what source data did you use, how did you come to these conclusions. So it is man and machine again. The judgment is still being made by the expert, no matter what the situation. So I'm with you. I don't think there's a mismatch of information. It's how you use it and how you use that insight in different industries.
And so it's really about getting people with good judgment in government.
Correct. And that's a skill to be developed.
Right. Okay, fantastic. This question of technology and its impact in the environment, Lishan, I want to bring this to you and to sort of throw a curveball on the question as well, because you know, this is the issue of managing climate change is one that China in particular is grappling with at a macro level, right? And does China see the march of technology, and do you see the Chinese government in particular as seeing the march of technology as helping or hindering its, in some sense, its political need to manage the effects of climate change?
These two have not been very closely connected in the Chinese context before in terms of discussion. You are right that Chinese policymakers are very serious about climate change and environment. And we started this year, the policymakers made 3 priorities, which is financial deleveraging, environmental protection, and poverty alleviation. US-China wasn't doing that. They wish that things were so easy. But if you look back, out of the 3 things, one is about inclusiveness, another is about environment, and that was one of the 3 most important things on the agenda. They are very serious about environment. In terms of the technology, so far, many of them, the technology are actually service related, so they are not necessarily draining the resources as we see in the industrial growth of the industrial revolution. Or some of these are actually providing the possibility of customer-made goods, C2M. C2M is very popular in China. Basically, people can more tailor-made, have their needs, order goods that's more tailor-made into the needs, rather than mass production. So if the technology provides more possibility for people to have more identity-related consumption, will that be actually reducing the mass production that we need? And as we know, I think that's again, that's the positive part we see. But so far, in other sectors like shared bikes or the sharing economy, that's actually reducing the pressure on environment in general.
Okay, fantastic. So in some sense, we haven't seen those connections being made explicitly. So perhaps that question is ahead of its time. We've got a question right up front here, and then we'll take a few more. So second row. Yeah, thank you.
Emel Karboulis, the Education Outcomes Fund for Africa and Middle East. I ask myself, where is the populism in this conversation? Do we have the explanation that it's risen because of inequality, or is something much bigger? I have the honor to sit here with my colleague Hedi Arbi. We were both ministers in the Tunisian transition government, and we are facing another election next year. Sometimes I ask myself, can we win elections without being populist? Because you've showed the slides of the percentiles, and that the 40 to 60% bottom didn't really see wage changes, even decrease in wage. You don't show actually how much percentage of population these people are, you know? And
40%. Percentile.
It's percentile. Okay, so the question is, you know, like with this anxiety that exists, even it's maybe not true, and other influences you've shown, is the question: are people actually open and willing to hear a very diversified message about sometimes we don't know the solutions to demography with their pensions and many other things?
Fantastic.
Where is the populism in this conversation?
Great. So how do we sell this message? If in fact we have such an optimistic message about technology, how do we sell this in the context of the current populist unease? Question back there. Yeah, right there. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Earth from Thailand. So my question is about AI. AI could replace or create new jobs, I understand that. But when considering the word jobs, do you mean the jobs for the country that can catch this pace, the countries that can develop AI? How about the countries that cannot develop these technologies or cannot create new things from the artificial intelligence? Will it create harmful effects for those countries? And will those countries will have to depend on the country that can develop this AI technology?
Okay, so AI losers and winners on a global scale. Is there a question on this side of the room? No? Okay, well, we will take one back there from Justin. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you all for being here. So besides gaining 1 trillion globally from improving the tax and take operationally, and in light of aging populations and soon to be insolvent social safety net programs in some cases, and the simultaneous future of job loss that could widen across skills, Could you all please discuss the relative merits of 2 or 3 policies that governments should be pursuing in an ideal world to raise sufficient long-term sustainable revenue?
Okay, so 2 or 3 policies to raise long-term sustainable revenue. Okay. Let us start with the question on populism, because I think that is perhaps the central issue here. That even if the people in this room are optimistic about the promise of technology, and even if we look at the sweep of history and we say we've actually in the past been able to navigate these sorts of shifts fairly well, there is the challenge of selling this message, and the message is not being sold well at all. And if anything, the anxieties are growing. So what advice would you have for politicians? I know none of us here on the panel are politicians, but what advice would you have for politicians? How might you guide politicians and the public more broadly? And do corporations perhaps and the media have responsibilities in this age of distrust of traditional institutions? So go for it, Diane.
So I thought I was the least optimistic, and I did refer to the populism.
Yes.
And I think you're going to get it until the capitalist system that we have actually delivers for people. And for many people, for many decades, it just hasn't delivered improvements in the standard of living. So it is tied up with the jobs question, and there will be some churn. But the unanswered question, and I don't know the answer, is how do you create those good jobs that will stick in places and give people the skills to get them? And I think that is the key question. Absolutely the right question that everybody's grappling with at the moment.
Okay, fantastic. AI losers and winners, I'm going to take that one to you again, Sreeram. And in particular, as we think about, the profound impact of the Industrial Revolution on the shift in power across countries in the world, right, and the consequent impacts on colonialism and the like. Is that something we need to be worried about, that a few countries will capture all of the benefits of AI? How do you see it, again, as a very global firm?
Well, with any technology, there are first movers and adopters. I won't look at it as I wouldn't look at it as winners and losers, right? And technology is changing at a rate and pace where you do need to follow very, very quickly, and you do need to embrace the new technologies. But I would argue that these are not standalone factors. The aging population, most of the aging population is in the Western world. That creates opportunities, right? So the fact that augmented intelligence is mainly being driven out of the US or some of the European countries at the moment doesn't necessarily create a problem for emerging markets, because what you have is the workforce that you can train and develop to adapt this technology and to solve and co-create innovation. So if you look at what's happening in Africa in terms of payments, in terms of banking for everybody, in terms of how technology is being used for agriculture, you wouldn't expect it to come out of Africa. But I would argue that those innovations are way ahead of what is there in the Western world. So I don't buy this argument that it's going to create winners and losers purely because of technology. But I think businesses, individuals, and governments have a role to play in leveraging the technology and driving it into mainstream, right? And I look at it as a problem of first movers versus adapters, and what role does each country want to play in that journey.
Okay. So we've got 2 policies for public revenue as we think about the challenge ahead, and I'll give each of you a policy to propose. Maybe start with you, Jonathan, and final word to Lishan.
We were in the session earlier was about land and wealth, and we were just seeing, particularly on land taxes, really different policies, and Canada doing quite interesting things versus other countries not even on that journey. So I think the land tax is an interesting place, but I'm not a politician. There are others better. I would just say every time we look at spending, there is a massive opportunity on effectiveness of spending, where governments are spending money ineffectively. So efficiency is often not bad, but effectiveness can be really poor. So I wouldn't run to the leap to say, I need loads and loads of new policies to low tax everything. Partly I need to spend the money I'm collecting better, as well as looking for new.
Okay. Lishan?
I'll tell you what happened and then my prediction of that as well. So when this year's Chinese economy is relatively slower than, and a lot of external pressure as well. So when the government needs tax revenue, where do they go to? And there's several different sources. One is to increase the tax backtracking for the private sectors and to be more heavy-handedly in terms of the implementation and collecting of tax. And another is they start to tax the movie stars who has actually evaded a tax, and that made a big international story. So that's a sideline story, but eventually you really want to make your coffer sustainable. It's not by killing your cow, but rather by investing on innovations or make the economy really being sustainable and resilient and has the power to generate more profits.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Li-Shin. So coming back to our central theme, the notion that free markets, one of our key innovations over the course of the last 100 or so years, is under threat, particularly in countries that have historically served as sources or crucibles of these policies, is something that we're still grappling with, something that we're still trying to get our heads around. And the question of what policies will allow us to preserve free markets, both as an engine of prosperity and as an engine of liberalism in these societies, is something that we again have to continue to grapple with over the course of the next few years. I like to be the eternal optimist in all of these things. Nairi says, the building will fall down, and I will say, this is an opportunity. So I will say that, the thing that gave me most, in some sense, hope from this conversation was something that Sreeram said, which is that we do still have a little bit of time. We still have a little bit of time to figure out what are the really important policy shifts that we need to make. In part because, as we can see from this room, as we can see from this audience, there is actually a lot of uncertainty about what those policies should look like. But it's good that we have a little bit of time on this issue. But it's also important that we recognize that we're living in this age of deep distrust, right? And this comes back to this issue of populism. And it's important that we show some quick wins, just from a purely pragmatic perspective, that we show some quick wins, that this is an area that we are starting to grapple with, starting to get a grasp of, and that we're starting to come up with some policy solutions or some proposals that will have an impact in addressing the profound shift in the nature of work that we are to experience over the course of the next generation. So I will leave you on that optimistic note, and we take a short break, I understand, and then come back for our final plenary. Thank you.